Hi everyone, welcome to episode 3.14 of Shotgun SharePoint, Hustle and Flow. This is proudly brought to you by the
Digital Alpha.
The Digital Alpha.
Technology for the new millennium.
And as a really special treat, we are going to be giving away just one Digital Alpha to the first viewer to call 188 I Love SharePoint.
Void where prohibited by our CEO.
Workflows are just like a nice way of automating business processes.
Right. It's a way you can sort of write a program in SharePoint without using any code.
One question I have is there's a bunch of different ways that you can set up a workflow.
Yeah.
So there are a few workflows that you can do without even touching the SharePoint designer, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So you just access them from the ribbon of your browser?
Yep. So you have, if you're running the SharePoint server, the full server, not Foundation, and Enterprise, you have the approval workflow and the collect feedback workflow, your collect signature workflow, and like your disposition workflow. And that's pretty much all you get out of the box. Anything else, you can create additional workflows on lists and document libraries in sites, but they're kind of children of those workflows that I just mentioned.
Okay.
Yeah,
so those are like templates.
Yeah.
Right. And once you create the workflows, if you're using one of the ones that you have to create the designer, those are accessible from the ribbon by any.
After you've created it.
Right, by any SharePoint user that you specify.
Okay, so next question. What is the difference between a workflow that you create in the designer versus one that you create in Visual Studio?
So I guess the real difference is sort of the toolkit that you have available to you. So when you create a workflow in the SharePoint designer, you're dragging and dropping different pieces of sort of actions and conditions to create a program.
And it's rule-based, right?
Right.
Not graphical.
No, it's graphical. So
Okay.
you're bringing these sort of graphical blocks together to form a sort of basically what you would call, I guess, a flow. So
Like a bunch
step A, step B,
conditional
step C.
actions. Yeah.
Right. When you do it in in Visual Studio, you just have more power, so you can do more things. You're not limited to just the sort of the little Legos or building blocks that the SharePoint designer gives you.
Yeah.
But you can put a custom action into a SharePoint designer workflow, right?
That's right.
Yes.
So
And that requires code, right?
So you can create a custom action, or basically you can create an additional building block for use in the SharePoint designer, but that would require code.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say the SharePoint designer is a lot easier to use than Visual Studio, and probably a lot easier to deploy a workflow or any sort of site updates to than actually trying to build it out in Visual Studio.
Yeah, and it's much more accessible to the average user.
Because you can download it directly from SharePoint for free, whereas Visual Studio, except for Express, is pay-per-use. So.
Okay. Can you make a workflow in Visual Studio without code, or do you have to write?
It's as far as I know, it's just code.
You
right?
can technically make one in Visual Studio without code, but there's no reason to. So if you're going to make it without code, you might as well just do it in the designer.
Okay. Cool. And then, so the workflows, I know like SharePoint designer workflows are declarative, and Visual Studio ones are compiled, but I don't really understand what does that matter in the end of the day?
It doesn't really at all.
Okay.
To the end user, they're not going to know the difference.
Okay.
Basically, the Visual Studio workflows compile into
SharePoint solution.
They compile into a sort of a program. Whereas with the designer, you're taking bits that have those little blocks have already been compiled, and you're just stitching them together.
Oh, okay.
So you can think of the little blocks as mini workflows that you're stitching together on a declarative basis. Whereas when you're doing in Visual Studio, everything's together and getting compiled.
Okay. Should we walk our many viewers through a typical workflow, like what the scenario would be?
Sure. So let's talk about the standard approval workflow.
Right.
So if you were designing the standard approval workflow from scratch with the the SharePoint designer, you would start by defining how the workflow gets kicked off. So you would say, I want this workflow to get kicked off every time a new item gets added. So every time a new item gets added.
To a given list or to all lists?
Well, at that point, you're saying to all lists.
Okay.
To all lists, this workflow is applied to.
Okay.
So when a new, let's say we apply it to the HR documents list.
Mm-hmm.
HR document library, say.
Mm-hmm.
So every time you upload a document to the HR document library, it's going to kick off this workflow. Now, the workflow is going to contain pieces like notify a user that they have to approve something,
Mm-hmm.
then create a task that asks them to approve something, and then you'd have to branch it. So you'd have one branch that said where the user responds with a "this is approved" document, and you get to notify the uploading user that their document has been approved. And then you can have another branch that says denied, and then the user can get notified that their document has been denied.
Okay.
So that's a pretty simple workflow.
Yeah.
About 5 or 6 working pieces, but they can get really complicated, and it's really only limited by what the user wants to create.
And workflows can be deployed at different levels too. You can deploy them at the site collection level, at the site level, the document library level, or this level. You can also, if you're using Designer, you can also deploy workflows so you can attach them to a content type, a specific content type, so to go for that content type. You can attach it for a specific column. There's a lot of flexibility with workflows.
So you can sort of make it part of your like governance strategy, right? To make sure people do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And
it helps eliminate those manual tasks with a normal business process that can kind of get lost in the shuffle if it's multiple steps and if something goes wrong, then you have to go back and find out where's this process breaking down. But with SharePoint, it's really easy to track that kind of stuff.
Right.
I know that one of the workflows that people create a lot are new employee workflows.
Yeah.
So that they'll create a workflow that so that all of this sort of new employee stuff gets done automatically. So an Active Directory account gets created, an email account gets created, they get emailed the new employee documentation, they get signed up for maybe some orientation classes, and all of that is just done automatically with one click. Whereas before they had SharePoint or workflows, they would have had to have a whole team organizing to make sure that new employees didn't fall through the cracks.
I don't know, is there anything else we want to talk about
I mean,
regarding workflows?
From the admin side, there's not a lot you really have to do to configure it at the farm level. If you do want users to be able to use SharePoint Designer, there is some settings at the farm level that you do have to enable. But other than that, I mean, the default workflows are pretty much good to go right out of the box.
Though one thing you do have to remember is that workflows operate in a separate context than the user. So what that means is the workflow has more privileges than the user running it.
Oh, right.
So
You can in 2010 in the Designer though. I think you can actually change the context
Yep.
of the user.
You can have a block where it's the user running, but in general, a workflow is running as sort of a super user. So if there's content that they can't access, the workflow can still access it.
I'd say did we talk about even email alerts are kind of a basic workflow too.
But those are like part of the approval workflow, right?
Yeah, I mean you can even get without using a workflow, so to speak, you can use just email alerts on document library where you don't even need it, where it's kind of like a small workflow without input.
Oh, so you just get like a notification.
You get a notification, yeah. So
Cool. Great. Well, I hope this has been an informative session. And don't remember, 188, I love SharePoint.
Digital Alpha,
Only one.
hot off the presses.
Yeah, so
I think with maybe 10 of these, you might be able to run one SharePoint front-end server.
Maybe.
Maybe.
That's a big
yeah, so it'll go fast. So call in and we will see you next week.
Bye.
Bye guys.
Bye.